Welcome to The Kill File, your favorite true crime podcast. I'm your host, Brittany Spears. Each week we will explore the dark corners of true crime, unsolved mysteries, and murder. Join me as we uncover secrets, investigate evidence, and dive into the chilling details of some of the most fascinating cases. Get ready for a journey into the dark unknown, because in The Kill File, nothing stays buried forever. Hey guys, welcome to episode 29 of The Kill File. I want to first remind you all to check out the merch shop on the website, thekillfile.com, and click Shop Merch. I'm adding some new cozy winter sweatshirts, etc., and am taking off anything that I feel the material is maybe too cheap or not as comfortable as I'm learning when I order my own things. So the sweatshirts and the hoodies are good ones with some good material. Also, I want to shout out all of you guys who have shared the social media posts from last week. I am so grateful that you are willing to help out The Kill File by spreading the word. That is what I need the most. Get the word out there. I hope to one day turn this into my job and not just a hobby, but to do so, I need more listeners. So thank you for all of you who are helping out to support the podcast. Okay, so today's episode, as you well know, is going to be part 3 of the Yorkshire Ripper. Peter Sutcliffe so far has attacked 12 women. Some he killed and some were able to miraculously survive. Trigger warnings for today are going to be murder, brutality, body mutilation, and rape. When we left off last week, Peter was headed back to the body of Jean Jordan, who he had murdered about a week prior, and if you remember, he had left some incriminating evidence at the scene, a traceable 5-pound note. He knew if her body was discovered, then the note could be traced back to him, as it was mint condition, and he had received it as part of his paycheck. Peter and Sonia had their housewarming party the evening that he headed back to check the body after no one had discovered it for a week. After dropping his parents off at home, he went to find the body of Jane that he had hidden in some bushes near a very prominent sex worker area for business. The whole time I was reading that no one had reported finding her body for an entire week, all I could think was that if people are using this spot daily for sexual interactions for payment, wouldn't people smell the decomposing body of Jean? I couldn't help but wonder if they could, but either didn't know what it was or maybe wrote it off as roadkill or didn't want to report anything because this was a known spot for sex workers. Maybe were afraid of getting in trouble. When Peter found the body of his victim Jean that night around 1 a.m., he started searching for her purse near her body and close to the area where he attacked her, and apparently he even looked under the body for the note. I was wondering if seeing his decomposing victim had any effect on him. He couldn't locate it near her body, so he started looking in a larger area but still could not find it. This is when his frustration would start to build and a rage inside him started to boil. Then, this piece of shit pulled Jean's already decomposing body from the hidden area and proceeded to take off her clothing. He would then throw them away as he could not find the 5 pounds he had given her when they had met. He decided to check the last spot that he thought she may have hidden the money, which would be her boots, but to no avail. He again looked around for her purse, but was unable to find it. This is when Peter got to the point where his frustration, rage, and fear, and what was said to be fury, made him feel as though not being able to find the note made the body of Jean seem as if it were mocking him. So, he then started to attack Jean's corpse with a knife out of pure rage. When he had slashed her stomach contents let out a smell that was foul, and this would force the Ripper to vomit. Yet, he still felt the need to continue to attack her already rotting remains. In a still rage-filled attack, Peter took glass that he had found from a nearby greenhouse and decided to use this to continue attacking the body. In this moment, he decided to do something that he had never done before, to confuse and make a mystery out of this quote-unquote Ripper killing, which is not usually associated with his victim. This part is graphic, just a heads up. He then used a piece of glass to try and decapitate the body of Jean so he could leave it somewhere, knowing that this would not only throw off authorities, but he could also hide the hammer marks that were left by the Ripper on his victims. He thought that he could make the police believe that this wasn't a Ripper killing, but would then think they had a new killer on their hands. The glass Peter tried to use to decapitate Jean was unsuccessful. This is when he would try to separate the head with what was said to be a hacksaw blade, but again he was unsuccessful and eventually gave up on the idea. He was still upset, thinking that because he couldn't find the note that he would for sure be caught this time. Still angry, he kicked Jean's body a few more times. Not wanting to try his luck and knowing that he had been out there for quite some time, still pissed, he ended up leaving the scene after finally giving up. It was said that when Peter reached his home, to his surprise, there wasn't much blood on his clothes, so he left his pants in the garage and later burned them with quote-unquote garden rubbish. The next morning around 10:30 a.m., 2 people discovered Jean's body close to the wooden shed that was near a pathway that was often used. This description is graphic, so just a heads up. Jean was found with her face in the ground and her legs and arms spread wide. Her body was obviously mutilated. In fact, it could be seen that she had been disemboweled. Her intestines were somewhat wrapped around her own waist when she was found. Despite Peter's efforts, it was obvious that Jean had been killed with hammer blows to the head. It was stated that the fact that Jean's body was found to be in such a state that the authorities knew the killer tried to decapitate her, that this fact would not be released to the press. It was apparent to the authorities that some of the wounds on her stomach were done some time after her death. I know they have ways to figure this stuff out, but to me it's so fascinating that they're able to tell this stuff from just studying the body. One of the investigators actually thought that someone had dug Jean up from the nearby cemetery due to the area being so close to Manchester's quite large southern cemetery. When the investigators soon found Jean's belongings close by, they no longer thought that she was a dug-up corpse. They found, not far from Jean's body, tights, a bra, underwear, boots, a coat, a cardigan, and a jumper. They could see that most of the clothing that goes on top of the woman was stained incredibly with blood and was said to be crawling with maggots. Under the nearby hedge that separated the allotment from the very popular pathway had been a depression in the ground, and this was also said to be crawling with maggots. They then found a wooden interior house door that had been leaned up against the woodshed nearby. The investigators figured out that the murderer had attacked his victim quite a few days before, put her body near the hedge where they could see the depression, and then covered Jean's body with the wooden door. They were able to then tell that the killer came back just the night before and removed the body from where it had been hidden, taking off the clothing and again mutilating her body before trying to decapitate her. They had this crime scene nailed to a T. They may not at the time had known about the note that Peter had been looking for, but the rest they knew fairly quickly. Also, how foul is it that Jean's decomposing corpse was riddled with maggots and so were her clothes? And Peter stripped her anyways and then further mutilated her body. He's an absolutely disgusting abomination. This next part is graphic as well, so beware. It was said that Jean's initial attack showed that she had received 11 hammer blows that was said to be done with such force that it actually flattened her head and made her pretty unrecognizable. Oh my god, this poor woman. It was later determined that during the second attack, Peter stabbed Jean a total of 18 times in her chest, breasts, stomach, and in the area of her vagina. Jesus, dude, she was already gone. What the fuck is wrong with you? Apparently, the stabbing attack had been so brutal and full of rage that her stomach had been ripped open. They found wounds on Jean from her left shoulder to her right knee. Some of the gashes were actually 8 inches deep that they were able to find on her right side. Oh my god, this guy is a fucking maniac. So brutal and so wicked. I can't even wrap my head around what this would look like. My brain, won't let me. After the news broke about the body that was found in the area, a small description was released of the woman that they didn't name. Alan Royal, which if you remember was Jean's common-law husband, whom she shared children with, called to alert the authorities that this could have been his wife, and then he was able to identify the clothing that they had found near the brutalized corpse. So during all of this time, Jean's purse had still not been found, but that was about to change. Jean was attacked and killed on the evening of October 1st, and it wasn't until October 15th that a man named Mr. Cox had gone to his allotment, which it's like a piece of land, either public or private, that someone can pay rent, usually a small rent, but they can pay in turn to grow their own produce on the allotment. Mr. Cox's allotment was on the new section near Princess Road, and here a fence had separated the old allotment from the new area, and underneath this fence, and sort of hidden in some long grass, he had found a leather-type green purse. Mr. Cox reported the finding to the authorities, and Alan Royal was later able to identify this as Jean's. The purse was a whopping 189 feet from where the body was discovered. When the purse was found, it was found open, and in the main part of the purse were cigarettes, makeup, and matches. Also in the purse, and a small side pocket of the outside part, was found a 5-pound note and a 1-pound note. The note was wet, but when it was dried, they were able to pull the serial number from it and able to trace it back to the Bank of England, which was able to find out that it was actually part of a batch that had been sent to Shipley and Bingley branches of the Midland Bank. They were able to figure out it was issued by a sub-branch located in Shipley, and this was just outside Bradford. This was issued just 4 days before the murder of Jean Jordan. The batch had been split up and paid out to many local businesses and factories for their workers' paychecks on September 29th and September 30th. The finding of this note was huge for the Ripper case, since they knew that the great distance that this note had traveled in such a short amount of time. They knew that if they found the owner of this note, they would be able to find the Yorkshire Ripper and Jean's killer. Long story short, because it took the authorities so long to find the note, it broadened the range of where the note could have traveled, and it didn't help to narrow down the suspects. It was said that, quote, the £5 note had been one of a sequence of 69 notes, part of a bundle of £55, and had been included in 127,500 distributed over to 30 firms in the area, employing over 8,000 men. End quote. So, although this could be of help, it would take a lot of time and over 30 officers interviewing 5,000 men. The authorities knew that this note was the best chance at finding the Yorkshire Ripper. An assistant officer on the case said they didn't think that they had interviewed the killer. In fact, they said that they were positive that once they interviewed him, they would realize it was him and they would be able to nail him on the crimes. Unfortunately, they had already interviewed Peter Sutcliffe and his wife Sonia, twice, in fact. 2 sets of different police officers interviewed the couple once on November 2nd, 1977, and then they interviewed the couple again on November 8th, 1977. In both interviews, Peter and his wife recounted the same stories, that the couple was home together on October 1st, and then were having their housewarming party on October 9th, which the authorities knew that this is when the Ripper had returned to the scene of the crime and further mutilated Jean's corpse. Peter's mother also confirmed the alibi when the police interviewed her, and neither of the different sets of police officers thought anything suspicious about Peter Sutcliffe when he was interviewed, and both reports said this. It wouldn't be until 2 years later that the second attempt to use the note would be conducted. The authorities were able to narrow down the number of firms from more than 30 down to just 3, and then narrow the recipients from 8,000 to just 300. After the death of a victim of his named Josephine Whitaker, they were able to find a boot print, but unfortunately this real clue that they had alongside some of the fake clues, as well like hoax letters and taped clues. Peter would, though, be interviewed 3 more times on January 13th, 1980, and Peter was actually wearing the exact same boots that the authorities had the picture of from the murder of Josephine Whitaker, but they failed to notice. This, coupled with the massive amount of unprocessed information in what was called the quote-unquote Ripper incident room, was tragic. There was also a report made by Detective Constable Laptew that voiced his suspicions of Peter Sutcliffe from the July 1979 interview that Peter had done, but this was not yet in the system. In fact, a lot of information on Peter Sutcliffe had been quote-unquote lost inside of the system, unfortunately. So, about the Jean Jordan murder, Peter was quoted as saying in his confessions, quote, I realized that she hadn't got the £5 note in her clothes and that it must have been in her handbag. I roamed about all over the allotments, frantically searching for the bag, but I couldn't find it. I was cursing the girl and my luck all the time, end quote. Oh, I'm sorry, did the fact that you threw her handbag when you drug her behind some bushes so no one would see what you had done to her not work out in your favor, you piece of shit? Oh, this made me so angry that he was cursing poor Jean. And his luck? When he couldn't find the note? Your luck? What about Jean's luck to have gotten in your car instead of the one that she was originally going to get into? It's like he's saying, poor him, what luck he had not being able to find the purse. In his confessions, he said himself that he hit Jean in the back of the head as they were trying to climb a fence, and because she fell and was moaning so loudly, he hit her again and again until she stopped moaning. This is when the car lights came on and he had saw that someone was leaving just before the next car came and parked in the same spot. When the car had started, Peter said he pulled Jean under some bushes and then threw her purse and other stuff out of the way. Then he said, as he is remembering it, he thought maybe he threw her quote-unquote handbag diagonally to the right. So I love that he is the reason he couldn't find the note because he threw her stuff, but of course he took it out on the poor corpse of Jean. I hate this guy. Okay, so the next victim of the Yorkshire Ripper was a woman named Marilyn Moore, a 25-year-old woman who was a sex worker. On December 14th, 1977, Marilyn was out working in what was called the red light district of Chapeltown, Leeds, when she saw a car slow down and she figured that they may be a client looking for sex work. While she was walking, the car passed her, but she had anticipated it would be a client due to the slowing down, so she crossed the street so that when the car turned around, she would be ready and took a right on the next street. At a small crossing down the street, she saw a car parked and a man who was standing near the car. She thought he had been waving at someone inside of a nearby house. She would describe Peter as around 30 years old, about 5'6", with a stocky build, with wavy dark hair and with a mustache and beard. After Marilyn got into Peter's vehicle, the pair took off for a spot that was said to be about 1.5 miles away. I guess Peter had told her that his name was Dave, and when he asked her what she was doing back on the street when he saw her, she replied that she was saying goodbye to a sick friend. Peter then drove towards the Prince Philip playing fields, if you remember, where he had murdered his first victim, Wilma, just 2 years prior to this. After the pair parked, Peter suggested that they get into the back seat, and while Marilyn agreed, she found that the door in the back was locked. As the Ripper came around to quote-unquote open the door for her, he tried to hit her on the head with his hammer, but he had slipped a bit and lost his balance at the same time. This caused him to hit her in the head at an angle and not directly like he had intended. Marilyn then screamed very loudly and started to fall on the ground, holding her head in her hands. Apparently, Peter shouted, quote, "Dirty prostitute bitch," while he hit her again. It was said that Marilyn could feel more hits to her head as she passed out. It was Marilyn's loud screams and now a dog that was also barking that made Peter think that it was probably about time to run. He spun his wheels and drove home to Bradford. What he didn't know was that Marilyn was still alive. When Marilyn regained consciousness, she was able to poorly walk to the road nearby and try to find a phone for help. It was said that once Marilyn reached the road, there had been a couple who spotted her, and the man left to run for a phone to call an ambulance for her. Marilyn was taken to Leeds Infirmary for an emergency surgery as she had apparently had pressure on her brain due to a fracture in her skull. The Yorkshire Ripper had hit Marilyn in the head 8 times, and she also had numerous bruises on her hands because she was trying to protect her head with her hands. I guess because her injuries were so severe, the authorities thought that her description of the Ripper may not be accurate. It was later found out that Marilyn would be taken to Leeds University Hospital and was actually questioned under deep hypnosis. I have always found hypnosis fascinating, and I want to try it sometime. I've seen some crazy clips on talk shows and even on America's Got Talent where Howie Mandel supposedly got hypnotized. That makes me think that it might be possible to do this to someone. But the thought that you have to keep an open mind during it and stay open to the suggestibility of it all makes me feel like it's not going to work on me. I'm a huge skeptic when it comes to anything supernatural or stuff like that, so I feel like I would be sitting there yeah, right, dude, you won't get one over on me. And that in itself, if it was real, would make it not work. But I do want to try. Do you have any hypnosis experiences? Let me know. So it was later said that Marilyn had called the police on 3 separate occasions thinking that she had seen the Yorkshire Ripper, but unfortunately, every time was just a false alarm. It turned out her sketch of his description would end up being a good likeness of Peter Sutcliffe, and she also stated that she thought him to have a Liverpool accent. Being from the States, I have no idea what this means, but I wish I did. About the attack on Marilyn, Peter was quoted in his confession saying, quote, "It was my intention to get her into my car with a minimum of fuss. I knew she had refused to get into one car, so I got out of my car and walked to the corner. She was only a few yards away, walking towards where I was stood. I walked back to my car and she came into view and I shouted, 'Bye now, see you later, and take care,' and I waved towards the houses on my left. I did this to give her reassurance that I was all right. I got in and started the engine and opened the passenger window. I asked her if she was doing business. She glanced at the house and said yes, and got in." End quote. This makes me so sad that if Marilyn had already called the police 3 different times thinking that she had seen the Yorkshire Ripper, that to me says that she was scared, and with good reason. It makes me so sad that she was obviously afraid, refusing to get into one man's car right before Peter saw her, probably because she was scared. So this sick fuck acted like he was being all polite and saying goodbye to set her at ease so that she would get in the car with him. I hate him. I fucking hate him. I hate his stupid face the most. I know you're not supposed to judge people by their looks, but I am. You can tell by his shit-eating grin that he's a douche and seems so proud of himself. The next woman that we are going to talk about is 21-year-old Yvonne Pearson, who was a mother of 2 children. She was also a sex worker, and on the night of January 21st, 1978, she left her babies in the care of her neighbor, who was said to be about 16 years old, and went to a pub called the Flying Dutchman. Love it. The name, not the situation. She was said to have left around 9:30 to try to go make some money that night. I guess Yvonne had already been caught for doing sex work, unfortunately, and was due to be in court in just 5 days on the charge of soliciting. Also, since this was not her first charge, she could be facing some jail time or prison time, which is sad. So, the same evening that Yvonne had gone out for work, Peter had been helping his parents move into their new home that was said to be near Bingley Center. I guess Peter's brother, Mick, and Peter's father, John, just figured when Peter refused to come in to have a drink with them both that he must have been just wanting to get home to his wife that night. Peter that night ended up passing his home and headed to Bradford to cruise around and hunt. While he was driving, he had almost gotten into an accident when someone was not looking and backing out of a side street that was in front of him. When he braked because of the car, he was surprised when he heard tapping on the front window of the passenger side. Yvonne opened the door to speak to Peter, and when he asked her where she came from, she replied that she had just good timing, and they could chalk it up to fate. Yvonne was wearing black pants and a black sweater when they agreed on the price of £5. The pair soon drove off towards what was said to be waste ground, aka empty land, that was near the back of a mill where Peter's father worked called Drummond's Mill. When they arrived at the spot and Yvonne exited the car, Peter was already ready with what was said to be a walling hammer, which, when I looked it up, said they're also called a mason hammer. They sort of look like a mini pickaxe, but they're not as curved. Peter proceeded to hit Yvonne over the head multiple times with his hammer. Right then, another vehicle pulled up right next to his own car. This is when the Ripper would pull Yvonne next to what was said to be an old sofa in an attempt to keep Yvonne quiet and from moaning too loud. Peter grabbed horsehair from the couch and stuffed it into her mouth and essentially down her throat, and then he also held her nose. When he would release her nose to see if she was still going to make noise, she did. So he would again then grab her nose and close it. After a while, the car parked next to him left, and sadly, Peter was now alone with Yvonne to do as he pleased. This is when he did his usual cruel and brutal attack where he would pull down her pants and pull up her shirt or whatever else to expose her breasts. This time, Peter kicked Yvonne in the head and on the trunk of her body. It was also reported that at one point in time, he actually jumped full force on Yvonne's chest with both feet and the weight of his body. He would actually hide her remains, covering her with whatever turf, soil, and debris was essentially around, trying to bury her body above ground. Peter then covered her with the old couch that was near her body. That next Monday, so her death was Saturday night, but by Monday she was reported missing, and as there had been concerns for her safety and for her life, there was also the thought that she could have just went into hiding to escape her court date that was coming up. The police did look for Yvonne and spoke to a nearby police force, but to no avail. On Sunday, March 26, 1978, which happened to be Easter, someone was walking by the area and noticed what seemed to be an arm sticking out from underneath the couch that Peter had laid over her body. This, coupled with the awful stench of decomposition as he got closer to her remains, led to the discovery of Yvonne's corpse. It was said that the person who found her at first thought she was a tailor's dummy. We hear this a lot in true crime, that people who find dead bodies often think it's a mannequin, and of course it never is. But I think your mind goes to the first reasonable explanation before dead body. You probably never in a million years think that you are seeing what is a dead body at first, and I totally understand that. When Yvonne Pearson's body was discovered, it was said that her head had been beaten to the point where she was unrecognizable. With the discovery of Yvonne's body came a few mysteries attached to it. The police didn't believe that the way her arm had been sticking out so obviously that she wouldn't have been discovered before this. They thought unless an animal had messed with her remains. Also, it was reported that a copy of the local newspaper called the Daily Mirror, which was dated on February 21st, was found under one of her arms, and to the authorities looked like it had been placed there on purpose. This date would be 1 month after she was murdered, which Peter denied placing there or even having gone back to the body, which of course leaves the question of who did that? The authorities were unsure at first of whether this was actually a Yorkshire Ripper killing or not. Although it was clear Yvonne had suffered massive blows to the head, they were so bad that the Professor David Gee thought during his examinations of the remains that the damage could have been made by a boulder and not a hammer. Also, they didn't find any stab wounds on Yvonne, even though her clothes were disheveled like the Ripper usually left them. About this murder, Peter would go on to explain that he had hit her and drug her and then spoke to the other car showing up and how he stuffed the couch innards in her mouth and held her nose until the car left. He said after the car left again, he was quote-unquote seething with rage as he kicked her head and her stomach. He then went on to say, quote, "After this, I remember acting very strangely. I talked to her and I apologized for what I had done, but she was dead. I put the set on top of her. I was very distraught, and I was in tears when I left her. This was the first time I had apologized to someone I had killed. I drove home. I cannot recall the time, but it was after 9 p.m. I can't remember if Sonia was in the house or not." End quote. He then went on to the fact that he supposedly stopped on the way back to his house and sat there trying to figure out why he did what he just did. See, here's my problem though. He talks about how he sat there trying to find out why he did what he just did, and this is the first time I've heard of him doing this. So you're like, well, even though he's a monster, maybe he does have some feelings, right? With the tears and all? But then during the same sentence where he is claiming to have stopped to think about why he committed this heinous act, he says, quote, "Oh, I've just remembered it might have been a walling hammer I used on Yvonne. There was 2 walling hammers in the garage of the house when I moved in." End quote. Something about the way he's pretending to have a conscience and then is just like, "Oh yeah, I might have used this specific hammer," like very cold and matter of fact, like he could just give 2 shits about Yvonne. Peter's next victim would be Helen Ritka, who was only 18 years old and was a sex worker. This attack would happen only 10 days after Yvonne, which is nuts. Now the Yorkshire Ripper was again spanning the area of his attacks to this time what was said to be the red light district of Huddersfield. Helen Ritka had a twin sister named Rita, and both of these young women were new to being sex workers. In fact, they'd only been on the job for a few weeks when Helen would unfortunately meet Peter. It was stated that the girls together had come up with a systematic way of working that they felt would put off any efforts of a man who was out to harm the sisters. The girls decided that they would try to accept clients at about the same time, giving the clients about 20 minutes for their business, and then they would meet up back in the same place, said to be about a block of public bathrooms located at a market towards the end of the Great Northern Street. I guess some of the other sex workers came up with what they considered to be a better system, where they worked in pairs to protect each other, and they would actually take down the license plate numbers of the cars that their partner was going with, and upon their partner's safe return, the paper was then ripped up in front of the client to ensure anonymity. On January 31st, 1978, Rita and Helen left their flat around 8:30 to head towards where they usually worked, in what was considered the red light area on Great Northern Street near the lumberyard. Around 9:10 p.m., Rita was able to see her sister get into a vehicle that she had described as a dark car on the opposite side of the street, and a few minutes later, Rita was then picked up by a man in a Datsun. When Helen got back to their meetup spot before Rita, she then saw Peter, who then proceeded to convince her that they had enough time for a quickie in the lumberyard not far from where she was. It was said that Peter had planned on using his usual style of attack, where he would suggest that they have sex in the back seat, when the woman would either find the door locked, or if it was unlocked, he would just attack her as she was starting to get into the car, obviously in a vulnerable position. However, this time Helen would throw Peter for a loop when she undid her pants in the front seat and said she was ready to start. It then said that to Peter's surprise, he became aroused, even though he didn't want to feel that way. He used the excuse of having to go to the bathroom and got out of the car, and when he returned, Helen had agreed to get out of the car and into the back seat for them to have sex. While Helen was trying to get into the back seat, Peter tried to strike her in the head, but the hammer caught the roof of his car and it only grazed or tapped Helen, and at this she thought that he had struck her with his hand. Obviously being terrified of him in this moment, Helen said, quote, "There's no need for that. You don't even have to pay," end quote. Oh, my heart, this made me ache for this poor young lady. She's only 18 years old, and let's be honest, that's still not an adult. It may be legally, but when someone's age number still has the word teen attached to it, they're not adults. Shit, scientifically, your frontal lobe doesn't even finish developing until after 24, which for all of us parents is fucking terrifying. Thinking of our kids being able to legally do whatever they want. How is it that people are legally adults when they're 18, but they can't even drink until they're 21, or rent a damn car until they're 25? Let's just be real with it and say that they aren't adults for a very long time. Anyways, after Helen told Peter that there was no need for his physical abuse and offering him a freebie out of fear, Peter was surprised that she didn't immediately yell for help when he first hit her. When she then asked him what that was, the Ripper replied with, quote, "Just a small sample of one of these." And then he struck her hard with the hammer on her head, and she fell to the ground and began moaning very loudly. This is when Peter realized that what he was doing was in plain view of 2 taxis that were parked close by, but unfortunately, they were out of their vehicles having a conversation. This is when the Yorkshire Ripper would drag poor Helen to the end of the lumberyard. She had stopped moaning, but she wasn't quite dead. It was said that her eyes were open and also her hands were held up trying to defend herself against any more hits from Peter. He then got on top of her and then covered her mouth with his hand, and she of course was still struggling and trying to get away. The Ripper then told her to stay quiet and she would be fine. Because Helen had sexually aroused him only a few minutes ago, he then proceeded to rape her, but he said that it was only as a means to keep her quiet. He is so full of shit, and what a fucking hypocrite. This just proves, at least in my opinion, that his killings have some sort of sexual element to them. I feel like he was just too embarrassed to confess that brutalizing women the way he did turned him on. Otherwise, what was the real point in exposing their breasts and pulling down their pants all of those times? Helen was, however, said to be the only victim that Peter did have sex with. After the taxis had left the area, Peter had headed back to the car to grab his hammer when Helen was able to stand herself up and staggered towards the car herself. Unfortunately, it was at this time that Peter hit Helen 2 more times on the back of the head and drug her to the front of the car. He then tried to throw away Helen's belongings. For what reason, I do not know. Peter could tell that Helen was still alive at this point, so he grabbed his knife and then he stabbed her multiple times in the lungs and the heart, and then before leaving her, he hid her behind a stack of lumber. When Peter returned home this evening, it was revealed that he had to wipe the blood splatter off his shoes with a sponge, and then he, quote, returned the knife to the kitchen drawer from where he had taken it. What? He just put the knife back in his kitchen after he stabbed a woman to death with it? Holy shit. This might be morbid, but here I am wondering, did he clean the knife first? Or did he just wipe it off and think that was good enough and then put it back? Can you imagine finding out this as his wife? Not only all about the horrific things that her husband did for sure, but then finding out that the knife is in your own kitchen and you used it? Oh my god. So when Helen's twin Rita returned after the 20 minutes that were allowed for H. John, she didn't see any sign of her sister. She hung around for a while waiting for Helen, but when she finally realized that her sister wasn't coming back, she headed back to their flat. It was unfortunately 3 whole days before Rita would be able to overcome her fears of the authorities and report her sister as missing. Apparently the morning after Helen's murder, the men who were working at Garrett's timber yard had indeed noticed a patch of mud that was stained with blood, and they also found a black pair of lace underwear that some asshat lumberyard driver who found them had pinned to the door of the shed. It was said that this wasn't unusual because many different things went on around that area, especially in the lumberyard after dark. After the authorities were notified about Helen's disappearance, it didn't take the police canine long to find her body once Rita had finally been truthful about their jobs as sex workers and gave the timeline of the events that night. I can only imagine how scared she was. After only 10 minutes of searching the lumber yard on Great Northern Street, they were able to locate Helen's body, and this was on Friday, February 3rd at around 3 p.m. It was stated that her remains had been covered with a sheet of asbestos behind a pile of lumber. Her belongings were scattered all over, with her shoes being about 20 yards away. It was said they found her body with her bra and what she was wearing that night, which was said to be a black jumper with a polo neck. These had been pushed up, exposing her breasts, and then other than her socks, everything else was removed from her body. The authorities found stab wounds to her chest, and they also saw, once again, she had been stabbed in the same spot multiple times. What is that about? I don't understand that. Why is that a thing for him? They also found scratch marks on Helen's chest. So, about Helen's murder, Peter would go on to say, quote, I told her not to make any more noise and that she would be all right. By this time, I was aroused sexually, so I had intercourse with her. I just undid my fly, I spread her legs out, and did it. It only took a few minutes before I ejaculated inside her. Her eyes appeared to be focusing on me when I was doing it, but she just laid there limp. She didn't put anything into it. Oh, I'm sorry, is the woman that you bashed in the head with a hammer and dragged around, and then who you proceeded to rape, not giving you enough effort for her rape? I don't give 2 flying fucks that this poor young lady was a sex worker. The moment you bashed her skull and she threw her hands up in defense and tried to get away from you, you no longer had consent, you piece of shit. You raped her as she laid there helpless and bleeding profusely, I'm sure. Peter would then go on to describe how he once quote-unquote finished, he got up and she began to moan loudly again, I'm sure in pain. And this is when he was worried the taxi drivers nearby would possibly hear her. He then said, quote, I couldn't drive away for obvious reasons, one being that she was still showing signs of life. I was worried sick that I was about to be discovered and was furious that she would not keep quiet. I took my knife from my pocket, I think it was the one with the rosewood handle, which is probably still at my home in the knife drawer, end quote. Oh my God, I hate this man. He makes me legitimately angry. Like, it would have taken everything I had not to jump over the table at this fucker during his confessions. I mean, I know you can't do that, you gotta continue confessions so that the woman can get justice, but man, just the way he talks about these women and his actions, so brazen. Ugh, when he said that he was worried sick that he was about to be discovered. I'm sorry, you're worried sick about being caught for doing despicable shit to women? What about these women's families who were worried sick about their loved ones? Their mothers, their daughters, their sisters, aunts, wives. Fuck you, Peter. The next victim we are going to speak about was a 40-year-old woman by the name of Vera Millward, who was at the time a sex worker living in what was said to be a rundown area and what they call over across the pond, Rundown Council Flat in Holme, Manchester. Upon research, I found that a council flat was what we would call here in the States as public housing or low-income housing. Vera was said to be in poor health with unfortunately only having one lung, having 3 large operations between the 2 years prior, and reportedly having constant stomach pains. She left her home around 10 p.m. that evening, letting her boyfriend know that she was quote-unquote heading out for cigarettes, which he knew meant that she would be working instead. Her boyfriend then knew that he wasn't going to see her for a few hours while she was out working. Vera had a regular standing appointment with a client on Tuesdays and Thursdays that usually just parked outside of her flat, which was located on Greenham Avenue, and he would just flash his headlights to let her know that he was there for her. For whatever reason, on this Tuesday evening, her client didn't show up, so she hung around what they said was a car trade, aka a car dealership, if I'm not mistaken, hoping for some business. Peter was the first person to come along and Vera got in. They drove towards the Manchester Royal Infirmary and found a quiet spot that was in a parking compound where it was known that sex workers would take their clients. I could not for the life of me figure out what a parking compound was. Like, in my head it was some kind of parking garage, but when I looked that up for the area, they actually call them something else, like a multi-story car park or something like that. Everything that I could find either said a police compound, which obviously this wasn't, or a fenced-in parking type lot with like a key code, which again, this probably was not. So I am not sure what in the hell a parking compound is. If you know what that is, let me know. Anyways, after Vera got out of the car, the Ripper attacked her with his hammer, and Vera tried to apparently fight him off. Good for her. Later, there would be a man who claimed to hear 3 separate screams for help around the grounds of the hospital, but he figured that they were probably just from a patient at the hospital. After Peter unfortunately killed Vera, he then dragged her body towards a fence and then proceeded to stab her with a knife he had. The next morning, a little after 8 a.m., there were 2 vans with 3 gardeners in each who pulled up to do garden work at the Manchester Royal Infirmary. While these workers were unloading the gear and tools from their vans, someone spotted what at first they thought was, again, a tailor's dummy. It had been laying near the temporary fence. Jim McGuigan, one of the garden workers, ended up walking towards Vera's body to take a more close look, and was of course horrified when he figured out that this was in fact the remains of a dead woman. Vera had been, unfortunately, hit in the head 3 times with the hammer. There was said to be brain matter and blood staining on her clothing all over her body. She was also dragged approximately 12 feet over gravel to that temporary fence where he left her. She was found to be laying on her right side with her arms folded under her, with her legs straight, and she was face down. Reportedly, Vera's coat had covered her from the neck down to her knees, and they also found that her boots were placed, quote-unquote, neatly on her body, as well as a piece of paper covering her face. She was found with her underskirt and dress had been raised, and she had a slash across her stomach so deep that her intestines were coming out of the wounds. They found her right eyelid to be punctured, and again she was repeatedly stabbed through one of the same wounds in her back, and this was just below the left side of her ribs. She also had a bruised eye as well. Authorities were able to make a cast from the tire tracks that were left at the scene and narrowed down the list of potential vehicle to 11 different types. Of course, One was the Ford Corsair that we know the Yorkshire Ripper, aka Peter Sutcliffe, drove. After Vera's murder, Peter would go on to say, quote, "Following Millward, the compulsion inside me seemed to lay dormant, but eventually the feeling came welling up, and each time they were more random and indiscriminate. I now realize I had the urge to kill any woman, and I thought that this would eventually get me caught, but I think that in my subconscious, this is what I really wanted," end quote. I call bullshit on this. I don't think for 1 second he wanted to get caught. I think he may have become more arrogant, more bold, and more deviant than ever. It was stated that Vera Millward was the Ripper's last victim in the year of 1978, and it was also said that this would be Peter's last attack on a sex worker as well. He would not go on to attack another woman until April of the next year, so 1979. When he finally attacked again, this time they were said to be more sinister, as they had been in the beginning of his killing spree. After Vera, the Yorkshire Ripper would go on to allegedly believe the next set of women were sex workers, but this was only in his head. If that's even the truth, because apparently the next set of women weren't even close to what would be called a red light district, and it was also said that besides the first one in the next set of victims for Peter, he wouldn't even talk to the women, nor try to pick them up in his vehicle anymore. Again, learning the story right alongside of you, I feel like we are about to see a new chapter of Ripper killings. Friday, March 2nd, 1975, on the Horsforth College campus, which was located just on the outskirts of Leeds, a student named Anne Rooney would be the next Ripper victim. Anne at the time was 22 years old, and during the mid-evening of this Friday, she was unfortunately attacked from behind. Peter would strike her in the head 3 times with his hammer, which later, when Professor Guy would examine her at Leeds General Infirmary, he would see the semicircle wounds left behind, but luckily for Anne, she would live. Anne was able to describe her attacker as a man being in his 20s, with a broad build, around 5 foot 10 inches, and also with curly, dark hair, and what she described as a drooping mustache. She was also able to describe the vehicle she thought she saw the man sitting in before he had attacked her. She described the vehicle as a Sunbeam Rapier that was dark in color. Peter did own a black Sunbeam Rapier at the time, and in fact, this car had been flagged by authorities many times for being seen in the red light districts of Leeds and Bradford. This man is all over the place. He goes from only attacking sex workers, with few exceptions, to now attacking a college student on a random campus? What the hell? It was said on February 22nd, 1979, the black Sunbeam had been flagged in Moss Side, which of course is where he had attacked Jean, and then again in the Manchester red light district, which is where he would become a quote-unquote triple area sighting, and this would mean that he needed to be interviewed by authorities as a potential suspect because of how often the vehicle was seen in these red light districts. Out of 850 Sunbeam Rapier vehicles listed close by, there were only 21 flagged in 2 of the areas, and only 3, including Peter Sutcliffe, that were flagged for 3 red light areas. Unfortunately, the authorities that were part of the investigation into Anne Rooney's attack didn't know this information was available in the system and didn't know just how important that information was. At the time of her attack, it was not included as a Ripper attack, as the size of the hammer was an issue and the authorities believed that it was not the Yorkshire Ripper who had attacked her. They also didn't have much information to go off of. It was only later, after most of the confessions made by Peter Sutcliffe, that he would finally admit to having attacked a college student in Bradford. The next Yorkshire Ripper victim was a 19-year-old young woman named Josephine Whittaker, who at the time was working as a building society clerk, which I found to mean like a receptionist or an office admin or assistant. Josephine Whittaker would be what was considered the first victim in the final 6 murders of the Yorkshire Ripper. Remember, these last 6 were not connected to sex work in any way that we know of, not that it matters, but it shows how Peter veered from his victim profile at the end. Although it is said that in Peter's mind, they were. We'll see about that. So much police presence in the usual red light district area caused the Ripper to venture out of his normal areas to find women to attack. It was stated that after people realized that the Ripper would attack any woman now, not just sex workers, it would cause the people throughout West Yorkshire to feel terror of being attacked. April 4th, 1979, Josephine was said to have been visiting her grandparents, Tom and Mary Priestley. During the visit, she had gotten to show them the watch that she had just bought for 60 pounds made of silver. Her grandparents invited Josephine to spend the night since it was getting so late. But her contact case was at home, and since she needed to get to work the next day, she decided to go ahead and walk home. She left her grandparents' house around 11:40 p.m. that evening, heading towards Sayville Park, where she was said to cross to the suburb of Halifax, Bell Hall, and Ivy Street, which is where she actually lived. This same evening, Peter was out drinking with his buddy Trevor again, and after the bars closed, he had dropped Trevor off, and of course, instead of going home, Peter drove around 11:30 that night, heading towards Halifax, and he was driving in his Sunbeam Rapier in the direction of Sayville Park. After seeing some people walking dogs, he then spotted Josephine, who was walking alone. Peter then parked his car, grabbed his hammer and his huge rusty Phillips head screwdriver, which he had, of course, sharpened, and sought out to follow Josephine. It was said that within only 10 minutes he had caught up to her, and the two were walking and talking together as well. When he would ask her how long she had to go, Josephine would tell him that she was walking back to her house from her grandparents' home, that it was quite a distance. As the pair were walking towards the Sayville Park area, they passed a man who had been walking his dog that night. This man would later be able to tell authorities that he had seen a man and a woman walking together that night, and the woman did fit Josephine's description and clothing. He described the man as being around 19 to 22 years old, medium build, around 5'8", looked like he hadn't shaved in 3 or 4 days, wearing a 3/4 length dark coat. He also described Peter as having greasy, slightly wavy, and mousy-colored hair that had been brushed to the left. Wow, what a description. Good for him for paying attention to his surroundings. As Peter and Josephine approached the park area, she would tell him that she usually took this shortcut and cut across the field, and this is when Peter would pretend to be surprised and told her, "You don't know who you can trust in these days." I hate this piece of shit for now getting to know his victim a little bit and pretending to be a good guy, knowing that he is the person who everyone fears right now, and also knowing what he's about to do to her. She was probably just walking with some dude who seemed nice enough, and she may have even felt a little bit safe in that moment, knowing that a man was walking with her and never knowing his intentions. It's gut-wrenching. They started to cross the field, and when they were out of reach of the lights from the road, this is when Peter asked Josephine the time. To his surprise, she was able to see it from the clock tower that was not far. Peter hung back a moment and was pretending to look at the clock, but what he was really doing was grabbing his hammer out of his jacket so he could attack her. He then proceeded to hit Josephine from behind with a ball-peen hammer, which knocked her to the ground, and of course she was moaning loudly in pain as he hit her again as she was laying there. Peter then noticed that there had been someone walking on the pavement from where they had just come from a few moments ago, so he dragged poor Josephine's body around 30 feet into the darkness. He was crouching over her body as he surprisingly heard some voices behind him. When he turned to look, he saw 2 people that were hurrying across the same field they were on, and they passed not far from him. Later on, a man who had been walking near the park at the time of the attack said that he heard a quote-unquote unusual noise. He explained it as a noise that kind of makes the hairs on the back of your neck and head stand at attention. This next part is gnarly, so just a heads up. As Josephine laid there still moaning loudly, the Ripper pulled away her clothes and started his attack. He would end up stabbing poor Josephine 21 times with that sharpened screwdriver in her chest and her stomach. He also stabbed her 6 times in her right leg. And this sick bastard also, quote, thrust the screwdriver into her vagina. Later on, it would be found that her skull was fractured from ear to ear. Just absolutely brutal. The next morning around 5 a.m., the bus driver who drove the first bus of the morning saw what he thought was a heap of rags in the park. Still, he reported it to the office of his bus depot, but since they didn't know that it was a body, they didn't call the police. Around 7:20 a.m., the authorities reached out to the bus depot asking them to move the bus stop that was located at the Saville, I'm sorry if I'm saying that wrong, Park Road, because they didn't want it near the crime scene. This is when the bus depot realized that the call from their driver was in fact about a body in the park. Jean Markham, around 6:30 that morning, was waiting for the bus at the Saville Park stop when she too had seen the same bundle in the park. As she was staring at it, she thought it was just a bunch of rags until she spotted a shoe close by. She started to head across the street to grab the shoe when, to her horror, she realized the bundle of rags was actually the body of a young lady. When she got to the body, she saw the young woman was dead, so she ran home and called the police. When Josephine's little brother named David was out on his paper route that morning, he was crossing the fields when he saw police all over the area. And sadly, when he saw the shoe, he realized that it was his sister's. He hurried home to tell his mom and stepfather. When they checked her room and realized she wasn't home, they understandably were grief-stricken and terrified as they called the police. The first officer that saw Josephine's body had thought that maybe she had been involved in a hit and run and was able to drag herself to that spot. Not long after this, though, they realized that she was actually indeed the victim of a murder. When they realized, along with her obliterated skull, that her clothes were moved and there was a quote-unquote frenzy of stab wounds, that after a break of 322 days, the Yorkshire Ripper had struck again. When the authorities found traces of metal pieces in Josephine's wounds, which could have been from Peter sharpening the screwdriver, they had the thought that the Ripper could be a worker at a place that you would find particles like this, for example, like an electrician, an engineer of some sort, or with mechanical connections, or even a tool fitter. When they were able to connect the boot print found next to the body, they were able to match the size of the boot to the Emily Jackson murder, but furthermore, they could see that the heel of the boot was made from maybe a molded rubber, or had a composition sole, which was found to be in industrial boots or army-type boots. Then, from the sole impression of the right boot, they saw some sort of twisting or worn areas in the middle, and this would lead the authorities to believe that the Ripper had to regularly press some sort of pedal with his right foot. This let them know that he could be some sort of lorry driver, aka truck driver, and then, with the metal shavings or particles they found, this would make sense with some kind of mechanical connection. This fascinated me about the boot print and the pedal. Holy crap, even back then that they could figure out the most insane details from a crime scene. It is so awesome and fascinating to me. After his trial in 1981, a local newspaper had reported that Josephine Whitaker's body was found with what was said to be a bite mark on her left, which would later be found out to be right, breast, and had been made right before she died. They were able to tell that whoever bit her had a gap between their two front teeth, like Peter did. For some reason during Peter's confessions, he had admitted to killing Josephine, but kept denying that he bit her. What they called at the time was the Ripper Squad of detectives were absolutely convinced that he did bite her, though. Which, to me, is very telling. For all of the details that he is willing to finally confess about the murders, there are parts or aspects he is holding back. Which is exactly what I thought. There was some sort of sexual gratification for him to brutally murdering these women. Apparently during his trial, the prosecution was saying that if there was a sexual component to these murders that he had committed along with the mutilations, then this would be evidence against what Peter claimed were his quote-unquote divine mission claims of why he was committing these acts. One sexual component that was pointed out in this case was the screwdriver that he inserted into Josephine's vagina. That is something the prosecution, and I agree, shows there was a sexual component to the murder. I believe it said in the trial that the defense was trying to prove that they couldn't definitively tell it was teeth, that it could have been scratches or from the claw of a hammer. However, the prosecution and the authorities were convinced it was a bite mark. So about this murder, Peter would claim to have thought that she was a sex worker because why else was she out so late that night, and that the voices told him not to fall for her talk. Of course, the real story, in my opinion, is when he would admit, quote, I saw Josephine Whitaker walking up the street. She was wearing a 3/4 length skirt and a jacket. I parked up the street with terrace houses and started to follow her on foot, and I caught up with her after a couple of minutes. I realized she was not a prostitute, but at the time I wasn't bothered. I just wanted to kill a woman, end quote. Yeah, that's what I thought. He knew that she wasn't a sex worker, but he didn't give two fucks. He even went on to say that she started telling him things that he called completely innocent, like how she had been visiting her grandparents and about her watch and how she enjoyed horse riding. And conveniently, when he confessed, he left out about the part where he jammed the screwdriver inside of her vagina, like they knew he had. It makes me wonder what else he left out of all of his confessions. What types of sexual acts or gratification was he leaving out about his horrendous acts? I knew from the very first time that he said that he had pulled up a shirt and exposed someone's breasts to quote-unquote see where he was stabbing, that this man was full of shit. And I was right. And that, my friends, is where we are going to stop for part 3 of the Yorkshire Ripper. Wowza, what a fucking case, right? Let me tell you guys, as I write these scripts and research for this case, at the end of part 3, I am officially at 39 pages of research and script to tell you guys this horrific but fascinating case of the Yorkshire Ripper. I love the research, I love the scripting, and I love giving you guys this information. I hope that you guys are enjoying this installment as much as I am giving it to you guys. Peter Sutcliffe, huh? What can we say at this point about this monster that hasn't already been said? Again, how the hell is this sick fucker married? You know, something that stood out in my research that I question a lot is when he talks about in his confessions how he gets home and usually doesn't have a whole lot of blood on him. Sometimes there's some on his shoes or sometimes on his clothes, but it's hardly any. But how? The brutality of these attacks and the slashing and stabbing just makes no sense to me. Wouldn't he be absolutely covered in blood? Does he just wear a dark coat all the time? Make it make sense to me, because as of now, it really doesn't. I feel like there are things that he might be leaving out, and this, as stupid as it might be, is one of the things that I don't think he's being honest about. Maybe he plans this more than he leads on, and if that's the case, he can't claim the voices are forcing him to do this, so he can't talk about his preparations? I don't know, but I can tell you one thing. Peter Sutcliffe is one sick bastard, and I cannot wait to find out how he is caught and what happens to him. I hope you guys will come on back next week on Monday when we wrap up the Yorkshire Killer saga with part 4, where we will cover his last 5 victims and finally find out what happens to this abomination. Stay safe, you guys. Bye! Well, that's it for today, you guys. Thanks so much for hanging out with me and listening to another episode of The Kill File. Don't forget to check out the merch shop, either at thekillfile.com and click Shop Merch, or you can visit thekillfile.printify.me/products for some awesome true crime merch. Also, follow along on the Kill File's socials for posts about episodes, pictures about the cases, for updates, and more. We are on Facebook, Instagram, and X as The Kill File, and we are on YouTube and TikTok as The Kill File Podcast. Also, feel free to check out the website at thekillfile.com, where you can learn more about me, your host. You can learn a little bit more about how The Kill File got started, and you can suggest a case right there on the website. Let me know in your case suggestion if you want me to shout out your name if I cover your case. There is contact info on the site as well. You guys have no idea how much I love to hear from you. It makes my whole day. Come back on Mondays wherever you get your podcast fix when we will cover another case on The Kill File, where nothing stays buried forever. Stay safe, you guys. Bye!